Chloé Ridel, thank you very much for joining our interview series.
My pleasure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. First of all, can you please tell us about the fate of the report? You submitted it to the Committee on Human Rights, Subcommittee on Human Rights. What will happen next?
So I submitted my draft report, initiative report, on June to the Committee of Human Rights, which is a subcommittee of the Foreign Affairs Committee here in the European Parliament. And then it left some time for other political groups to table some amendments on my draft report. And amendments will be discussed all through September. And we have a vote in the Foreign Affairs Committee in October. And then we have the final vote in the plenary session of the European Parliament at the end of November.
All right, good. Your draft report acknowledges the lack of a universally accepted definition of transnational repression. How should the EU conceptualize this phenomenon in legal and policy terms, especially considering the practices of regimes like Turkey, Iran, China, and Russia, to ensure both legal precision and operational flexibility?
Yes, you're absolutely right. There was no definition of transnational repression in the EU law or in the international law. Recently, the UN adopted a definition for transnational repression because it's a growing phenomenon, as I tried to describe in my report. So I suggest in this report a definition, an EU definition for what is transnational repression, because if we don't know what it is, we cannot fight it properly. So I can read the definition because it's very specific. So we define transnational repression as a state-organized. It's state-organized. It's not organized by companies or they can be proxies, but it's state-organized actions that cross borders to coerce, control, or silence individuals through physical, legal, or digital means. And this is a growing phenomenon. This is a growing phenomenon that is quite concentrated. Actually, you have 80% of all transnational repression actions that are committed, 80% of actions that are committed by only 10 states in the world. And among those states, you have China, you have Turkey, you have Iran, you have Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, you have Belarus. So, you know, it's very concentrated phenomenon, and you have Russia, of course, and it's committed by authoritarian regime that wants to silence members of their diaspora or political opponents or journalists, and so for the EU, it's a big challenge because, of course, it is a foreign interference. It is a security matter, and it targets human rights defenders that we have the interest of protecting, and we are not doing enough to protect them.
Right. Given that transnational repression by authoritarian and repressive regimes blurs the lines between external authoritarian influence and internal security threats, should the EU frame this challenge primarily as a human rights issue, a security concern, or a hybrid phenomenon demanding an integrated policy response?
I think that this is all of it at once. It is a human rights issue, of course, because it targets human rights defenders, and I will just come back to it after. And it's also a security issue, a sovereignty issue, because we cannot accept that foreign authoritarian regimes come to our streets to threaten people that are legal residents and that are under our protection. You know, it's just it also becomes a threat to us. But unfortunately, now in Europe, transnational repression keeps on happening. It's either physical threats, poisoning, it can be digital also surveillance. And I take the example of Russian diaspora, okay? You know that there was a major move from Russia, notably after the total invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And you have, for instance, more than 90 journalist agencies, Russian, that came to Europe to continue to exercise their job freely, you know, and it is in our interest of protecting those journalists because they are the last free Russian journalists in this world, you know, and they still speak to the Russian people. And we know that Putin expand his power by controlling the minds of the people. And if we can to fight this mind, you know, kind of war with Putin, we need journalism that are free and that can still speak to the Russian people back home. So it is in our interest to prevent transnational repression from happening against those Russian journalists from Russia. So, yeah, it's a security issue, human rights issue, but democratic also issue, I think.
Right. Authoritarian regimes, including China, Russia, Turkey, and Iran, have weaponized digital platforms to target exiles. How can the EU ensure that Digital Services Act is effectively enforced to mitigate these risks, particularly protecting vulnerable groups like women human defenders from online harassment orchestrated by authoritarian actors?
Yes, so as you pointed very well, digital transnational repression is growing, and you have authoritarian regime that use social media to harass opponents, and this targets a lot of women. You are right to say it, with kind of sexual videos. Sometimes we can see. So it's a specific kind of violence, but that is very growing, and that I mean, social media platforms are enabling this violence to happen. They are not doing enough to prevent transnational repression from happening online, and they should know.
The companies.
The companies. I mean the companies, because they are responsible for big public spaces now, where a lot can happen, where public debate happens. So you need to have rules, because we cannot have big public spaces that have such impact on people's lives that are controlled by private companies, and we have nothing to say about it. So in Europe, we voted a very strong legislation policy called the Digital Services Act, and we are still waiting for it to be effectively enforced. Because we can see that, for instance, there was an investigation opened against X, Twitter. For the investigation has been launched 2 years ago now, and there is still nothing, no conclusion, no sanctions announced. Whereas, I mean, the violation of the Digital Services Act by X has been very clear. You know, there's no moderation of content anymore. You have a lot of disinformation, and you have manipulation of algorithm to boost, for instance, a certain type of content, right, or Elon Musk tweets or whatever. So we would need to enforce effectively the DSA, the Digital Services Act, to make those big companies accountable. Because when I said that transnational repression was a state thing, it's true, but states rely on enablers. That can be, for instance, social media, or that can be spyware businesses, for instance, and those proxies, those enablers, have to be taken accountable for that repression as well.
Iran, Egypt, Turkey, and Tajikistan are notorious for coercion by proxy, targeting relatives of exiles to silence dissent abroad. What practical measures can EU adopt to recognize, document, and respond to this diffuse and intimate form of repression?
Well, transnational repression, you're right, can happen in the way that the authoritarian regime will target members of your family that stayed home while you went abroad to seek some exile or refuge. And, you know, it's very hard. Currently, the EU does not protect family members who can be threatened by authoritarian regime, because they are relatives of a big human rights defender or whatsoever. So I think that we should enable the program, the EU program called protectdefenders.eu, to also protect family members of a defender, and not only the defender himself, because we know that authoritarian regime use threats against family to repress human rights defenders.
Right. Given that Turkey, Russia, and China systematically abuse Interpol red notices and extradition treaties to pursue political exiles, what reforms should the EU promote within its judicial cooperation frameworks and at Interpol to prevent instrumentalization while safeguarding legitimate law enforcement cooperation?
So the abuse of Interpol red notices is a very important matter for me. And it's a very important part of my report because, as you mentioned, we can see that even if Interpol is aware that there are abuses of red notices, there is still a problem. You still have authoritarian regime that send or ask for red notices against human rights defender, whereas those red notices are supposedly targeting terrorists or very big criminals. And for instance, you have currently more than 200 red notices from Tajikistan targeting human rights defender living in the EU. So we need to raise awareness among member states not to arrest, not to execute those red notices and to have a coordinated EU response in the matter. And so in my report, I suggest that transnational repression be included into the mandate of Europol, this kind of European police that we are trying to build, and that Europol can give an assessment, can assess red notices, the relevance of those red notices when they target human rights defenders, so that Europol can give an assessment to states and exerts some kind of pressure on national governments so that they don't execute a red notice of Interpol that is an abuse. And we could, for instance, recently see the case of an Iranian activist in Italy back in 2017 who was arrested by Italy and then they freed him, but it was a red note on the basis of a red notices issued by Iran. We could see also the case of Paul Watson, who is an environmental activist. He defends whales, and basically he was targeted by a red notice issued by Japan, but he could live in France freely, could live in Germany freely, but he was finally arrested on the basis of this red notice by Denmark. So what kind of no coordination is this? He was freed, but after months in jail, and clearly the red notice against him was an abuse. So we need to stop this abuse, and one way to do it is to get the EU involved and give the EU the power. EU cannot have the power to execute red notice, of course, because it's a competence of the national police, but to assess and to say, hey, here, this is a red notice that is not right and that is an abuse, so please, you should not execute it.
Right. How can the EU promote harmonization of national legal frameworks to ensure that no member state becomes a permissive jurisdiction or safe haven for authoritarian actors from regimes such as Belarus or Egypt, while respecting national sovereignty and legal diversity?
I think that we need more coordination at the EU level to tackle transnational repression. I think that transnational repression should be more discussed among ministers of internal affairs, security, among ministers of foreign affairs, among head of states as well. It was discussed recently in the G7 forum, and it is a matter for all democracies in the world, because we can see a kind of authoritarian internationalism, that building itself, and notably through transnational repression, they are helping each other to control and coerce and silence their political opposition. Whereas we have the interest of protecting this political opposition, because this is sometimes the last free voices of a civil society in some countries. So we need to do more to coordinate at the European level, to raise awareness at the European level. Sometimes I could notice and acknowledge during doing my report that security services have difficulties assessing what is transnational repression, have difficulties seeing it. So you would need, and I suggested in my report, to have like expert of transnational repression in each security administration in each member state, like a contact point or something like that. It exists, for instance, in Canada, in Australia, in the US. They have team specifically responsible for transnational repression involving a lot of different ministries. So it's important that we build the expertise within each nation on transnational repression, and that all of this be coordinated at the European level through Europol.
All right. Oppressive states like Turkey and China often use religious, cultural, and educational institutions abroad as instruments of covert surveillance and influence. Mm-hmm. How should the EU policy distinguish and regulate these activities to protect democratic norms without stigmatizing legitimate diaspora engagement?
Sure. I think this is indeed a problem, and we need to control funds that go to religious, for instance, institution. You know, we cannot allow authoritarian regime or, adverse regime to fund NGOs or religious institution in the European soil without controlling the use of those funds. I think this is something we have to counter, because it's a growing phenomenon, and it's preoccupying. Yeah.
Right. Given that authoritarian regimes actively manipulate divisions within diasporas, for example, Turkey's polarization of Turkish communities in Europe, how should EU integration and anti-radicalization strategies respond to these fractures to avoid inadvertently amplifying authoritarian influence?
Sure, this is a bit. Another topic. It's not transnational repression per se, what you mentioned, but is manipulation of diaspora to harm a country or to create some a conflict. And we can see it in my country, France, where you have this association, Turkish association called the Grey Wolves, les Loups Gris, which is a very dangerous group that we in the end forbid and dissolved. But it is an example, because there was very violent demonstration from those members of this group, Grey Wolves. And yeah, they were exerting a kind of control on the Turkish diaspora in France, saying that how they should behave or not. And it prevents good integration also in the French society from Turkish immigrants. And so we need to fight back, and we need to have state solution against those extremist, association, and also trying to be everywhere to provide people with good public services and integration services through works, through the learning of the language, of the values, and so that we can prevent radicalization, because radicalization happens when there is discrimination. Extreme people come and talk to criminalized people and say, look, France is discriminating you, doesn't want you here, so you should abide by this Sharia law instead of whatever, how it works. And, to prevent that, we must prevent discrimination from happening, and that those people feel very part of the national community in Europe. So it's a matter of integration to fight radicalization, I think, of course, and security matter to be able to locate, to forbid those kind of association and groups when they are formed, if they are dangerous.
Right. Your report recommends focal points on human rights defenders within EU delegations. What skills, mandates, and resources will these officers need to respond effectively to transnational repression, particularly from aggressive regimes like Russia and China, in high-risk environments?
I think that it's important that we have contact points in every EU delegation throughout the world that can gather information on how authoritarian regime can exert transnational repression. And it's all about coordination to fight this growing phenomenon. We need contact points in EU delegation, and we need contact points in each national administration. And it's through the exchange of information that we will tackle it. And we are stronger together in Europe. You know, if we gather so many information and experts through different countries, and Europol have a good role in coordination, we can gather a lot of information and help victims of transnational repression. Sometimes they don't even know that they are victims. You know, there are people who are being followed, who are being surveilled until the day that they are being attacked. You know, people that have spyware on their phones and they don't know because they are not trained to cybersecurity. And so we should. In my report, I want to incentivize and raise awareness about spyware, to say that first the EU should ban the exports of spyware technologies that are produced in Europe, ban those exportation of spyware to authoritarian regime, because we know that this will be used against us and against human rights defender in our soil. And we should also, when we know that there is a human rights defender and that he's or she is at risk of transnational repression, say, hey, come to our office, we will explain a few security rules to you as a matter of prevention, so that you can check your phones on a regular basis or your computer to make sure that there is no spyware on it, because nowadays it's very easy to hide a spyware on the phone or on a computer.
And lastly, do you see a role for the EU in spearheading an international legal instrument specifically addressing transnational repression, modeled on Magnitsky-style sanctions, to confront regimes such as Belarus, Saudi Arabia, China, and Turkey? How might this enhance global accountability and norm setting?
Well, actually, there is already a EU sanctions regime that exists. And we want this EU sanction regime to apply also to states because of transnational repression, that commit transnational repression. So I call in my report to enlarge the EU sanction regime so that it effectively targets transnational repression. And there is also a traditional demand from our group, from the Socialists and Democrats group, that the sanctions by the EU be decided at a qualified majority and not unanimity. Because with qualified majority, often you go nowhere. The only people we manage to sanctions are mostly Russian people. 70% of the people sanctioned against the EU sanction regime are from Russia. I'm sure that many more countries in the world, as I've described to you, can be sanctioned in the name of human rights and of EU sanctioned regimes. So if we don't go towards qualified majority, we will have difficulties to apply the values we believe in human rights.
Chloé Ridel, thank you so very much for your time.
Thank you.